Marcus Lee stood in line at Gate 37 of the Luna Space Terminal, his broad shoulders straight despite his exhaustion. After 6 months commanding exploration missions in deep space, all he wanted was to get home to Earth and see his family. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other as the line moved slowly forward. "Boarding passes ready, please," called a computerized voice. "First-class passengers may now board Nebula 7 bound for Earth." Marcus pulled his boarding pass from his pocket. The Stellar Alliance had given him a first-class ticket as thanks for his recent mission. He had saved an entire research team from a failing space station near Neptune. Not that anyone here would know that. He had packed his decorated uniform jacket in his carry-on bag rather than wear it. Today, he just wanted to be a normal passenger. As he approached the gate, a young Korean woman in a crisp blue uniform gave him a quick once-over. Her name tag read Jae-ho Kim. Her smile faded when she saw him. "Sir, this line is for first-class passengers only," she said, her voice cool. Marcus held up his boarding pass. "I am in first class." Jae-ho's eyebrows rose slightly. She checked his pass twice, as if looking for a mistake. Finally, with a small frown, she scanned it and waved him through without another word. Marcus had faced this kind of treatment before. As one of the few black pilots in the Stellar Alliance Flight Corps, he had learned to keep his head high and not let it bother him. Still, it stung every time. The Nebula 7 was the newest commercial starship in the Earth-Luna fleet. Its gleaming white interior curved in smooth lines. Soft blue lights lined the ceiling, and the viewing windows were large and crystal clear. Marcus found his seat easily -7A, a window spot with extra legroom. He stored his bag in the overhead compartment, but kept his jacket with him. His mother had always told him to keep his credentials close when traveling. "The uniform speaks when you can't," she would say. Today, Marcus had chosen not to let the uniform speak for him, but he wasn't taking any chances with the jacket itself. As other passengers boarded, Marcus noticed several of them giving him curious or surprised glances. A middle-aged Korean couple took the seats across the aisle from him. The woman smiled politely, but her husband frowned and whispered something to her. Marcus pretended not to notice and looked out the window at the busy spaceport. The Luna Space Terminal was a massive structure built into the moon's surface. Through the window, Marcus could see the Earth hanging in the black sky, a beautiful blue marble wrapped in swirling white clouds. The sight never got old, even after all of his years in space. "Excuse me," said a stern voice. Marcus turned to find Jae-ho standing in the aisle, her arms crossed. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jae-ho asked, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "This is first class." Marcus took a deep breath. "Yes, I'm sure. Seat 7A. Jae-ho looked at her tablet. "ID, please." No one else had been asked for ID after boarding. Marcus pulled out his civilian ID card and handed it over. Jae-ho studied it carefully, then handed it back without apology. "Can I get you a pre-flight drink?" she asked the Korean couple across the aisle, turning her back to Marcus. "Excuse me," Marcus said calmly. "I'd like a water, please." Jae-ho didn't turn around. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said, still facing the other passengers. The Korean woman looked uncomfortable. "Please serve this gentleman first," she said quietly. "We can wait." Jae-ho's shoulders stiffened. She turned slowly and faced Marcus with a tight smile. "What would you like?" "Water, please," Marcus repeated. "Are you sure you wouldn't be more comfortable in economy class?" Jae-ho asked. "That's where your kind usually sits." A hush fell over the nearby passengers. The Korean woman gasped softly. Marcus felt his cheeks grow warm, but he kept his voice level. "I'm very comfortable right here. Thank you. Just the water, please." Jae-ho stared at him for a moment, then walked away without responding. Marcus turned back to the window, his jaw tight. This was supposed to be a simple trip home, not another battle for basic respect. The Korean woman leaned across the aisle. "I'm sorry about that," she whispered. "Not all of us are like her." Marcus nodded his thanks but didn't trust himself to speak yet. Jaiho returned a few minutes later with drinks for the Korean couple. She placed them carefully on their tray tables with a warm smile. Then she practically dropped a plastic cup of water on Marcus's tray without looking at him. Water splashed onto his pants. "Oops," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "Let me get you a napkin." She walked away again and didn't come back. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Good afternoon, passengers. This is Captain Ta Park speaking. Welcome aboard Nebula 7, bound for Earth. With me today is First Officer Han Kim. We are honored to be piloting this special flight." Marcus sat up straighter. Special flight. This was just a regular Luna-Earth shuttle, wasn't it? Captain Park continued. "Some of you may have heard rumors about the Nebula 7. I can now confirm that this ship has been fitted with experimental warp technology. Don't worry, we won't be using it on this trip. We're simply transporting the system to Earth for further testing. Our flight time will be the standard 6 hours. Murmurs of excitement spread through the cabin. Warp technology was still highly experimental. If it worked, it could cut travel time between planets from months to days, or even hours. The possibilities were endless. Marcus was immediately interested. As an exploration pilot, he had been following the development of warp drives closely. To be on a ship that carried such technology, even if it wasn't being used, was exciting. The pre-flight safety briefing began. Jaiho and the other flight attendants demonstrated the emergency procedures with practice movements. When Jaiho reached Marcus's row, she avoided looking at him entirely. Soon, the engines hummed to life. The Nebula 7 lifted smoothly from the spaceport and turned toward Earth. The moon's gray surface fell away beneath them, and the blackness of space surrounded the ship. The blue Earth grew larger in the windows. Despite the unpleasant start to his journey, Marcus felt himself relax as they entered space. This was where he belonged. The stars, the planets, the endless vacuum. They had been his home for years. Out here, your skills mattered more than your skin color. When you were saving lives or navigating dangerous asteroid fields, no one cared what you looked like. The seatbelt sign turned off with a soft chime. Passengers began to move around the cabin. Marcus stayed in his seat, content to watch the stars. He pulled out his tablet to check messages from his family. His mother had sent several excited notes about his homecoming, and his younger sister had promised to make his favorite dinner. Jaiho appeared again, pushing a cart down the aisle. She handed out hot towels to the passengers, to everyone except Marcus. When he politely asked for one, she pretended not to hear him. The Korean woman across the aisle frowned deeply. She handed her own towel to Marcus. "Here," she said. "Please take mine." "That's very kind, but I don't want to take yours," Marcus said. "I insist," the woman said firmly, glaring at Jaiho's back. Marcus accepted the towel with a grateful nod. The woman's husband looked embarrassed, but didn't say anything. As the flight continued, Jaiho's behavior didn't improve. She forgot Marcus's meal until he reminded her. She served his coffee cold. She responded to his polite requests with barely concealed annoyance. Marcus kept his cool. He had faced worse in his career, and getting angry wouldn't help. Besides, in a few hours, he would be home with his family, and this unpleasant flight would be just another story to tell. Little did he know that this routine trip was about to become anything but ordinary. 2 hours into the journey, Marcus was trying to nap. The constant small insults from Jaiho had tired him more than the actual travel. He had finally found some peace by closing his eyes and thinking about his mother's cooking waiting for him on Earth. The Nebula 7 cruised smoothly through space. Outside Marcus's window, the vast asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter drifted by. Most ships took a careful route around the belt, but the Nebula 7's advanced navigation systems allowed it to take a shortcut through a less dense section, saving nearly an hour of travel time. Suddenly, the ship shook. Marcus's eyes snapped open. His years of flight experience told him this wasn't normal turbulence. Something was wrong. The captain's voice came over the speakers, tight with concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Park. We're experiencing some unexpected solar activity. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further notice." Solar activity. Marcus frowned. He had checked the space weather reports before boarding, as all pilots did by habit. There had been no warnings about solar flares or storms in this sector. He looked out his window but saw nothing unusual among the distant asteroids. The ship shook again, harder this time. A few passengers gasped. The lights flickered overhead. An older Korean woman sitting 2 rows ahead turned around, her face worried. "Is this normal?" She asked no one in particular. "It's just a bit of turbulence," Jaiho said as she hurried by, checking that everyone was belted in. Nothing to worry about. But Marcus could tell by the tightness around her eyes that she was lying. Something was definitely wrong. The ship lurched violently to one side. A bag fell from an overhead compartment. The engines made a whining sound that Marcus recognized as a power fluctuation. Definitely not a good sign. "Attention all passengers." Captain Park's voice came again, now clearly strained. "We are experiencing technical difficulties due to an unexpected solar flare. Our navigation systems have been damaged. Please remain calm and follow all crew instructions." Marcus knew what that meant in pilot speak. They were in serious trouble. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, reaching for his uniform jacket in the overhead compartment. Jaiho rushed over immediately. "Sir, you need to remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," she said sharply. "I'm a pilot," Marcus said quietly. "I might be able to help." Jaiho's eyes narrowed. "Sure you are," she said with a dismissive laugh. "Please return to your seat immediately." Before Marcus could respond, a deafening alarm blared throughout the cabin. Red emergency lights began flashing. Many passengers screamed. The ship's AI system activated, its calm voice at odds with the chaos. "Warning. Collision alert. Warning. Collision alert." Marcus looked out the window and felt his blood freeze. A massive asteroid, at least half the size of the ship, was drifting toward them. It must have been hidden in the shadow of a larger asteroid until now. Without fully functioning navigation systems, the ship hadn't detected it in time. The captain's voice cut through the alarm. "This is Captain Park. We have a situation." His voice sounded pained, as if he was injured. "Both myself and First Officer Kim have been hurt by a console explosion. The manual controls are difficult to operate. We are on a collision course with a large asteroid. Impact in approximately 17 minutes. Panic erupted in the cabin. A man started praying loudly. A woman held her crying child. Jaiho's face had gone completely white. "All flight attendants to emergency stations," Captain Park continued. "Prepare passengers for possible impact procedures." Marcus knew what that meant. The pilots didn't think they could avoid the collision. They were preparing for the worst. Jaiho seemed frozen in the aisle. The other flight attendants were moving, getting the emergency equipment ready, but she just stood there, staring at nothing. Marcus touched her arm gently. "Jaiho, I can help. I'm a Stellar Alliance pilot with experience in crisis navigation." His words seemed to snap her out of her shock, but not in the way he'd hoped. "Get back to your seat," she nearly shouted, pulling her arm away as if his touch burned. "Stop making things worse with your lies." Marcus stepped back, hurt but not surprised. Even in a life-or-death situation, some people couldn't see past their prejudice. "All passengers, secure all loose items and assume the crash position when instructed." First Officer Hand's voice came over the speakers now. He sounded even worse than the captain. "We are attempting emergency maneuvers, but everyone should be prepared for impact." Marcus looked around the cabin. People were terrified. The Korean couple across from him were holding hands, their knuckles white. The older woman who had spoken earlier was trying to comfort a young man next to her who looked like her grandson. Marcus made a decision. He couldn't sit by and do nothing, not when he might be able to help. He grabbed his uniform jacket from the overhead bin and put it on. The silver pins and patches of the Stellar Alliance Flight Corps gleamed under the emergency lights. As he started moving toward the cockpit, Jaho stepped in front of him again. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded. "To the cockpit," Marcus said firmly. "The pilots are injured. I can help." "You're not going anywhere," Jaho said, putting her hand on his chest to stop him. "You're just a passenger trying to cause trouble." Just then, the ship's AI spoke again. "Emergency protocol initiated. Seeking qualified personnel. Is there a certified pilot aboard?" This was a last resort system, Marcus knew. It activated only when the ship's AI determined that the current pilots were unable to safely operate the vessel. The older Korean woman who had been sitting a few rows ahead stood up. She pointed at Marcus. "This man is a pilot. I recognize him." All eyes turned to Marcus, including Jaho's. "What?" Jaho said, confused. The woman continued, her voice stronger now. "This is Captain Marcus Lee. I saw him on the news last month. He saved those scientists on the Europa mission. My grandson has his poster on his wall." Marcus nodded to the woman gratefully, then turned to Jaho. "I've been trying to tell you. I'm a Stellar Alliance pilot with asteroid field experience. The captain and first officer are injured. I need to get to the cockpit now." Jaho stood frozen, her mouth opened slightly, as Marcus pulled his official pilot ID from his jacket pocket. The holographic seal of the Stellar Alliance glowed in the dim light. "Every second counts," Marcus said firmly. "Either help me get to the cockpit or get out of my way." For a moment, Jaho didn't move. Then, slowly, she stepped aside. "Thank you," Marcus said, moving quickly toward the front of the ship. As he approached the cockpit door, the ship's AI scanned his ID chip automatically. Pilot ID recognized. Captain Marcus Lee, Stellar Alliance Flight Corps. Cockpit access granted. The door slid open with a hiss. Inside, the scene was worse than Marcus had feared. Captain Park was slumped in his chair, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. First Officer Han was conscious, but clutching his right arm, which looked badly burned. The control panel was sparking, and several screens were cracked or blank. "Captain Lee," Han said, recognition in his pain-filled eyes. "Thank the stars. We're on a collision course with that asteroid." He pointed to the main view screen, where the massive rock was now clearly visible. "Navigation is fried. Manual controls are sluggish. We've been trying to change course, but..." He winced in pain. Marcus moved quickly to the pilot's seat. "I've got it now. Both of you should get to the medical station." "No," Captain Park said weakly, straightening up a bit. "This is my ship. I stay." Marcus nodded, respecting the captain's decision. "Then let's save your ship, sir." He strapped himself in and took hold of the controls. They were indeed sluggish, resisting his movements. The asteroid loomed larger in the view screen. According to the countdown timer, they had less than 10 minutes until impact. Marcus took a deep breath. This was going to be the most difficult flying he'd ever done. But as he looked back at the frightened faces of the passengers, including Jaho, who now stood watching from the cockpit doorway, he knew failure wasn't an option. "Everyone hold on tight," he said over the ship's comm. "This is going to be a rough ride." With skilled hands that had navigated the most dangerous regions of space, Marcus began the delicate work of trying to save the Nebula 7 and everyone aboard. Marcus's hands moved quickly over the controls. Years of training and experience guided his every move. The massive asteroid grew larger on the view screen with each passing second. 8 minutes until impact. "First Officer Han, what's the status of the thrusters?" Marcus asked, eyes fixed on the controls. Han checked a flickering display. "Main thrusters at 60%. Secondary thrusters failing. Steering jets operational but weak." Not good, but Marcus had worked with worse. "Captain Park, can you access the ship's computer? We need to run calculations for a slingshot maneuver." Captain Park tried to sit up straighter, wincing in pain. The main computer is damaged. We'd need to recalibrate manually. His hand shook as he reached for a keyboard. "Let me," said a quiet voice from the doorway. Ji-ho stood there, her face pale but determined. "I know the ship's systems." Marcus nodded. "We need all hands right now. Take the engineer station." Ji-ho moved to the small console on the side of the cockpit. She couldn't look directly at Marcus, her earlier behavior clearly weighing on her mind. "Input these coordinates," Marcus instructed, rattling off a series of numbers. "We're going to try something unconventional." Ji-ho typed quickly, her fingers steady despite her fear. "What are you planning to do?" "We can't outrun that asteroid, and we can't destroy it," Marcus explained. "But we might be able to use its gravity to our advantage. A slingshot maneuver." "But that's incredibly risky," Captain Park said. "One miscalculation." "It's our best chance," Marcus said firmly. "If we time it right, the asteroid's gravitational pull will actually help us change course." First Officer Han looked at Marcus with newfound respect. "Captain Lee, I've heard of your flying skills, but this is crazy, maybe." Marcus gave a small smile. "But I've done crazier things in the asteroid fields near Neptune. Trust me." 6 minutes until impact. The cabin was eerily quiet. Passengers held each other, many with their eyes closed in prayer. The older Korean woman who had recognized Marcus earlier was speaking softly to her grandson, telling him to be brave. In the cockpit, Marcus guided the ship into position. "Ji-ho, I need thruster calculations for a close approach at Mark 730. Ji-ho's fingers flew over the keyboard. A moment later, she said, "Ready." "Execute on my mark," Marcus said, his voice calm despite the tremendous pressure. 3, 2, 1. Mark. The ship lurched as the thrusters fired. Marcus fought with the controls, which still responded sluggishly. The asteroid now filled the entire view screen. They were heading straight toward it, and passengers who could see the approaching rock gasped in horror. "Captain, we're on a collision course." First Officer Han shouted. "Not for long," Marcus said, his concentration absolute. "Ji-ho, prepare for full starboard thrusters in 5 seconds." Ji-ho looked terrified, but nodded. "Ready. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now." The ship banked hard to the right, engines screaming in protest. For a terrible moment, it seemed like they wouldn't clear the asteroid. Its cratered surface was so close that individual rocks could be seen clearly through the view screen. Then, incredibly, the ship began to curve around the massive rock, riding its gravitational field like a surfer on a wave. The maneuver put enormous strain on the hull. Metal groaned, and warning alarms blared from multiple systems. "Hull integrity at 82% and falling," Ji-ho reported, her voice tight. "Just a few more seconds," Marcus said through gritted teeth, fighting to keep the ship on its precarious path. The asteroid began to fall behind them as they completed the slingshot maneuver. A cheer started to rise from the passengers who realized they were going to miss the collision. But the celebration was premature. As they cleared the asteroid, a secondary alarm sounded. "Main engine failure," Han shouted. "We're losing power." The ship began to spin, its momentum from the slingshot now working against them without engine power to stabilize their course. "We're being pulled into Jupiter's orbit," Captain Park said, his face grim. "Without main engines, we'll be trapped in the gravity well." Marcus thought quickly. The slingshot had worked, but it had put too much strain on the already damaged engines. Now they faced a new danger, being pulled into Jupiter's atmosphere, where they would be crushed by the giant planet's immense gravity. "There has to be a way," he muttered, scanning the systems for any option. His eyes fell on a control panel that was slightly different from standard models. The experimental warp drive. Captain Park had said they wouldn't be using it on this flight, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "The warp drive," Marcus said. "Is it operational?" Captain Park looked shocked. Technically, yes, but it's untested in actual space conditions. It's only supposed to be transported to Earth for further development. Do we have a choice? Marcus asked quietly. After a moment, Captain Park shook his head. No. But I must warn you. No one knows exactly what will happen if we activate it. I studied the theoretical models, Marcus said. What if we don't use it for a full warp jump? What if we just use small, controlled bursts to stabilize our trajectory? Jaiho looked up from her console. Is that even possible? In theory, Marcus said. It's never been attempted, but the math suggests it could work. The ship continued to tumble toward Jupiter, its massive swirling clouds now visible in the distance. They had maybe 10 minutes before they'd be caught in the planet's upper atmosphere. Do it, Captain Park said, making the difficult decision. You have my authorization, Captain Lee. Marcus nodded and turned to Jaiho. I'll need you to reroute power to the experimental drive. Can you do that? Jaiho swallowed hard but nodded. Yes. As she worked, Marcus carefully studied the warp drive controls. They were unlike anything he'd used before, but the basic principles were similar to systems he'd trained on. Power rerouted, Jaiho announced. Warp drive at 68% capacity. That'll have to do, Marcus said. He looked at Captain Park. Sir, I recommend you make an announcement. This will be rough. Captain Park activated the ship-wide comm. Attention all passengers. This is Captain Park. We have avoided the asteroid collision thanks to Captain Lee's skilled flying. However, we are now experiencing engine failure and are being pulled toward Jupiter. We're going to attempt an emergency procedure using the experimental warp technology. Please secure yourselves as best you can. This will be unprecedented. Marcus took a deep breath. Here goes everything, he said quietly. He activated the warp drive, but at only 10% power, just enough for a tiny burst. The effect was immediate. The ship shuddered violently, and the stars outside seemed to stretch briefly before snapping back to normal. But their tumbling slowed. It's working, Han exclaimed. Our course is stabilizing. One more burst, Marcus said, making quick calculations. Jaiho, I need 15% power this time. Precisely when I say. Jaiho nodded, her fingers poised over the controls. The earlier hostility in her eyes was gone, replaced by total focus and a growing respect. Now, Marcus called. The second burst was stronger than the first. The ship groaned, and for a terrifying moment, Marcus thought they might break apart. But then they steadied completely, their course now taking them safely past Jupiter. We did it, Marcus breathed, allowing himself a moment of relief. We're stable. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the passengers who had been watching the drama unfold through the cockpit door. Captain Park put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. That was some of the finest flying I've ever seen, Captain Lee. You saved everyone aboard. First Officer Han nodded in agreement. The Stellar Alliance will want to know how you used the warp drive. That was revolutionary. Marcus smiled tiredly. Let's just focus on getting to Jupiter Station for repairs before we worry about making history. He turned to find Jaiho standing beside his chair, her eyes downcast. Captain Lee, she said quietly. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Marcus replied. You did your job when it counted. No, Jaiho said, her voice breaking slightly. I was wrong. So wrong. The way I treated you. We can talk about that later, Marcus said gently. Right now, let's just get these people to safety. As Marcus turned back to the controls, setting a course for Jupiter Station, he felt something shift in the air around him. It wasn't just that he had saved the ship. Something more important had changed as well. The Jupiter space station loomed ahead, a sprawling structure of metal and lights orbiting the giant planet. Marcus guided the damaged Nebula 7 toward the emergency docking bay, his hand steadied despite his exhaustion. Jupiter Station. This is Nebula 7 requesting emergency docking, Captain Park said into the comm. His voice was stronger now, though pain still lined his face. "We have multiple system failures and injured crew. Nebula 7, this is Jupiter Station Control. Emergency docking approved. Bay 12 is clear for your approach. Medical team standing by." Marcus carefully lined up the ship with the docking bay. Without the main engines, he had to rely on the small maneuvering thrusters, which made precise control difficult. The ship drifted slowly toward the station, small puffs of gas visible as Marcus fired the thrusters in short bursts. "Everyone prepare for docking," First Officer Han announced over the ship's comm. "It may be rougher than normal." In the passenger cabin, people strapped themselves in tightly. Many were still in shock from their near-death experience, but a sense of relief was spreading as the space station grew larger in the viewports. The older Korean woman who had recognized Marcus earlier smiled at her grandson. "See, I told you we would be safe. Captain Lee is a hero." The boy nodded, eyes wide with admiration. Just like in the news vids. Jai-ho moved quietly through the cabin, checking on passengers. She had returned from the cockpit once the immediate crisis was over, determined to do her job properly. Her face was pale, but composed as she helped an elderly man tighten his seatbelt. "Will we still get to Earth?" a worried woman asked her. "I don't know," Jai-ho answered honestly. "The ship needs repairs, but we're alive, and that's what matters." The woman nodded, and Ji-ho moved on to the next passenger. As she worked, she could feel eyes on her. Some passengers who had witnessed her earlier behavior toward Marcus were watching her with disapproval. Ji-ho felt the shame burn inside her, but she kept working. There would be time for apologies later. Back in the cockpit, Marcus guided the ship into the final approach. "Docking in 30 seconds, he announced. "Brace for contact." The ship shuddered as it slid into the docking clamps. Metal groaned as the clamps locked onto the hull, and there was a loud hiss as the airlocks engaged. "Docking complete," Marcus said, finally allowing himself to relax slightly. "We made it." Captain Park put a hand on his shoulder. "Thanks to you, Captain Lee. I'll be recommending you for the highest commendation the Stellar Alliance offers." Before Marcus could respond, the cockpit door slid open. 3 medical workers in white uniforms rushed in, carrying equipment. "Captain Park, First Officer Han, we need to examine you immediately," the lead medic said, moving toward them with a scanner. While the medical team tended to the injured pilots, Marcus completed the shutdown procedures for the ship. His mind was already turning to the report he would need to write about the experimental use of the warp drive. The engineers back on Earth would be very interested in how small bursts had stabilized their course without initiating a full warp jump. A station official in a blue uniform appeared at the cockpit door. "Captain Lee, I'm Station Director Min. We've been informed of your actions today. Quite remarkable." Marcus nodded politely. "Just doing my job, Director." "Hardly just your job," Director Min said with a smile. "Using an experimental warp drive to stabilize a ship in flight. That's never been done before. The scientific community will be very excited to hear about this." "I'm happy to brief your engineers before we leave," Marcus offered. "The data could be valuable." "Indeed it will be," the director agreed. "But first, you should rest. We've prepared quarters for you and all the passengers. The Nebula 7 will need extensive repairs before it can continue to Earth." In the passenger cabin, the airlocks had opened, and people were beginning to disembark. Medical teams moved through the crowd, checking for injuries and offering support to those who were shaken by the experience. Jai-ho stood by the exit, helping passengers as they left. Her movements were mechanical, her mind elsewhere. When the last passenger had gone, she remained at her post, waiting. Eventually, Marcus emerged from the cockpit. He looked tired but calm as he walked down the aisle toward the exit. When he saw Jai-ho standing there, he paused. For a long moment, neither spoke. The empty cabin was silent except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems connected to the ship. Jai-ho took a deep breath. "Captain Lee," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to apologize to you. Marcus waited, his face neutral. The way I treated you was. Jiho struggled to find the right words. It was unacceptable. Disrespectful. Wrong. Her eyes filled with tears. I judged you based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong. You saved all our lives today when you had every right to let me face the consequences of my actions. Is that what you think? Marcus asked quietly. That I would let people die because one person was unkind to me? Jiho looked down. No, that's what makes this worse. You're a better person than I am. Today wasn't about proving anything to you, Marcus said. It was about doing what was right because every life on this ship matters, regardless of how they treated me. Jiho nodded, tears now flowing freely. I understand that now. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry, and I will learn from this. Marcus studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. Then I accept your apology, Jiho. She looked up in surprise, then shook his hand with gratitude in her eyes. As they walked together off the ship, they found a crowd gathered in the arrival area. News of their dramatic rescue had spread quickly through the station. People were taking pictures and recording videos. At the front of the crowd stood the Korean woman and her grandson. Captain Lee. The boy called out, waving excitedly. Can I get your autograph? You're amazing. Marcus smiled and walked over to the boy. What's your name? Jun. The boy said, his eyes wide with admiration. Well, Jun, I was just one part of a team, Marcus said, signing the boy's tablet. Everyone worked together to save the ship. But you're the hero, Jun insisted. Marcus glanced at Jiho, who was watching from a few steps away. Sometimes the real heroes are the people who learn and grow and become better, he said. Remember that, Jun. The story of Nebula 7's near disaster spread quickly across the solar system. News reports highlighted Marcus's innovative use of the warp drive and his exceptional flying skills. Videos taken by passengers showed the moment he took command in the cockpit, and interviews with those aboard painted a picture of calm courage under extreme pressure. Less discussed in public, but much talked about within the Stellar Alliance, was the incident with Jiho. 3 weeks later, as a direct result, the Alliance implemented new anti-discrimination training for all commercial flight crews. The Nebula 7 incident became a required case study for every space transportation company. 6 months later, a newly repaired Nebula 7 prepared for takeoff from Earth to Mars. Among its crew was Jiho Kim, now working as part of a diverse flight team after completing extensive sensitivity training. As passengers boarded, she greeted each with genuine warmth and respect. When a familiar face appeared at the gate, Jiho smiled. Welcome aboard, Captain Lee. Marcus nodded as he handed her his boarding pass. Just a passenger today, Jiho. I'm heading to the Mars Academy to give a lecture on emergency navigation, and perhaps something about the unexpected applications of warp technology. Jiho asked with a knowing smile. That too, Marcus agreed. The engineers have been busy with the data we provided. They think my little experiment might lead to a whole new way of using warp drives. More precise, more efficient. He paused. How are you finding your new position? Different, Jiho said honestly. Better. I'm learning every day. That's all any of us can do, Marcus said. As he moved past her into the ship, Jiho called after him. Captain Lee, thank you. Not just for saving us that day, but for everything after. Marcus smiled. Safe travels, Jiho. As the Nebula 7 lifted off once more, carrying Marcus Lee toward his next destination, it symbolized more than just a technological milestone. It represented the journey that happens when people face their prejudices and choose to change. A journey just as important as any voyage between planets.